All right, so first of all, I think it's worth talking briefly about some terminology. I always do these sorts of things at the beginning of my talks because there's so much confusion around methods in general. Privacy is no exception. So privacy concerns people, okay? Privacy is not primarily about data. Privacy is about people having control over their own lives, decision making, who has access to them, their person, their property. It also might have something to do with who has access and how to their data and how much say they have over that. But the key point about privacy is it's about people. It gets muddled up with this other thing called confidentiality. Confidentiality is solely and completely about data. Okay, so confidentiality is a boundary which is set around data in terms of where it can and can't move. So it may be an agreement between two people, I'm telling you this in confidence, or it may be there's some legal boundary, or maybe there's some technical boundary based on security, or so on and so forth. This is about the movement of data. And a lot of the conversations in this area are really talking about confidentiality when they're claiming to talk about privacy. And that's one of the issues here. Okay, there's a thing called anonymization, which is essentially a set of technical processes which are designed to achieve confidentiality. There's a technical process called statistical disclosure control, which is one of the elements one needs to effectively anonymize data. It's not the sole element, that's another confusion. Anonymization and STC are not the same thing. One of the real offenders here is this thing called differential privacy. Now, differential privacy is a perfectly good tool, but that's it. It's a tool. It does not actually deliver privacy. It's a misnamed tool. So I'm going to be talking across this space of things, different topics, reflecting on the change in the data environment, how that's affecting all of these issues and what we might do about that and what role AI might have to play in that. So the problem space that we're operating in broadly conceives of three elements, and we could add to this list. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but this is how I'm going to talk about it. Data automation and the human technology nexus. So data, and apologies, I know there's a few people in the audience who have seen this set of slides a few times. Okay, so there's this thing called big data. This is the only time I'm going to use this. I think that it's not a very useful term. It tends to get thrown into conversations, presentations, talks, and so forth. As a way of explaining something, it explains absolutely nothing. We tend to be focusing on this kind of amorphous thing that's happening, and sometimes it's referring to some social, cultural transformation, other times it's referring to specific forms of data. And I just require more precision when people are talking to me about this. So we talk about volume, we talk about velocity, we talk about variety. Those three elements are often brought out to explain what the term big data means. And this is one of these kind of curious terminological things where people insist that things begin with the same letter, and then anything that doesn't begin with that letter doesn't get mentioned. So one of the key elements that should be talked about in this area is open data. Open data is a very important transformation which has positive and negative consequences. It's an important element of the set of phenomena that get labeled big data. So what we're talking about here, though, is that we've got a mass of data. Data's kind of almost filling up society. It exists in a way that it didn't exist before. So as a cultural phenomenon, that's what we're actually referring to. On the level of specific details, new types of data, new controllers, new archives, everybody and their dog has data these days. Social media growth, commercial use of data over the last 20 years is obviously, as previous speakers have indicated, exploded, and so on and so forth. One of the things that doesn't begin with V that should be mentioned when we're talking about that term that I'm not speaking about anymore is linkage. Linkage is really important. It's really important methodologically, and it's really important in terms of how it's affecting those social cultural processes. All these bits of information being linked up. Again, the previous speaker gave some indications of some of the things that are going on at that commercial level. So new data linkage developments, new data being linked, new forms of combining, fusing, enhancing, linking, emerging data. There's a whole range of stuff going on, which is to do with drawing in information from multiple sources in order to make inferences. Now, another process, and we're just about to shift over to this automation, is real-time, the real-time nature of these new forms of data. Data is arriving and has the potential to be analysed in parallel to the process that's generating the data. And that has transformative effects. And the early versions of this were very focused on financial information, but now we're seeing it happen with other forms of data. And the previous speaker mentioned predictive policing, which is another area in which this is now becoming functional. So going on to automation now. So we've gone through this process, and this process is reflected both in academia in terms of our methods, types of data we have access to, but also in terms of the social, cultural, commercial, and governmental processes. So actually back there should be another one here which I could represent as the survey, where you specifically go out and ask people information for the purposes of collecting information. And at the beginning of this process, there's been this change where we're collecting data on the back of doing something else, or data is being created on the back of doing something else. So this is transactional data. So this is when you want some service or some good, and you hand over some of your data in order to secure that service or good, as well as handing over some money. So it's actually what's happened here is in fact there's now two economic processes going on instead of one. So there's one where you're paying some money, receiving some good or service, and then there's another process in the other direction where you're all handing over your data, and usually you're doing it for free, but there might be some implicit economic transaction there, or occasionally even explicit economic transaction there as well. This is social media, effectively. This is user-generated data. This is the start of the phase where people start to generate information about themselves in various forms and ways. And we're just moving into this phase now, probably started about 5 years ago in earnest, but it's building up automatically generated data. So this is sensors, various forms of automated system that are generating data as part of their process. So this kind of leads on to this notion of the Internet of Things, where everything's a data generator, everything consists of a sensor, a processor, and something for receiving and sending information as part of its manufacture. Okay, so in terms of social science, but also policy analytics, there's some serious implications of this data arriving in tandem with the process that's generating it. So this is a kind of old style, traditional idea about how academic work, or in fact analytics work that's happening within organisations outside of academia, has impact. So, and you could put something other than policy down in this left-hand corner. I think about it in terms of policy analytics as a kind of generic idea. So at some point you have some data, you do some analysis on data, it produces findings. The findings have some impact, maybe a change in policy. This affects the behaviour in the system, and that generates new data. This process could typically take years. Okay, so what we're edging towards, and some of the systems that previous speakers have referred to indicate this is a situation where, well, essentially we cut out the middleman here. So we've got data and policy happening in real time. So you can imagine going forward 10 years perhaps, where you actually have a policy instrument which looks more like a thermostat. It's a control system. So you set your policy up and then you tweak it on your dial until you get the right level of behaviour from whatever system you're trying to control with your policy. That's pretty scary, also potentially interesting for some purposes. So the human technology nexus. So these are essentially some statements in terms of the ontology of this. So the first assertion is that all data, all information, all of our attributes are now socio-technological. Now actually this has probably been so, we could go back in history and we could look at how this has happened from very far back, but there's something about what's happening now which is categorically different in terms of the degree of embeddedness. We actually lack a relevant discipline or perhaps a mode of study for this, where our disciplinary structures as social sciences are set up around socio-physical human beings. And although various disciplines have been trying to reinvent themselves as digital versions of their own disciplines, what we really lack in it is the object of study is fundamentally changing. And our academic endeavours need to reflect that. Human identities are embracing the digital. So the assertion here is that human beings are merging with their artefacts. It's the singularitarian hypothesis. We haven't crossed the Rubicon yet. Now the Rubicon here is the point in which some of our identity actually is digital. So at the moment we have an increasingly intimate relationship with our artefacts and with our data. But we're not far off, technologically, from people starting to invest some of themselves into their digital representations. And that's very transformative when you're thinking about ethics. Another key point about this process is that our understanding lags behind our technology. So early in human development, by which I mean basically any time up certainly until the 20th century, but possibly further, our understanding has driven the technology development. It's now flipped round, and we're catching up, and the lag is getting bigger in terms of human beings being able to understand what the hell's going on in this socio-human technological nexus. So this is some gadgets. These actually are, this is quite old now, this is 2012. So this is a human driver of a drone, and the driving that's going on here, for those people who aren't aware, is entirely thought processes transmitted by EEG. So the human being has a thought that makes the drone go left, right, up, faster, slower, whatever. And we're getting quite good at this. There's a sport now, drone racing, mentally driven drone racing. Okay, so that's one of the interfaces. This is another one where there's two human beings hooked up to each other again through electrodes on their scalps. Now this one on the left is actually moving the hand of the person on the right, but just by their thought processes. So again, it's a connection which happens like, I'm now moving this person's body. What's happening to our identities is a very interesting social science question. Okay, so this is an experiment carried out in Maryland by the University of Maryland in 2014, I think. So group of students in 10 different countries, I think it was 100 in each, were asked to give up their gadgets, any electronic gadgets, for 24 hours. The thing to guess is, and they were paid a fee when they got to the end of the 24 hours, was something like $100 or something of that sort. So kind of enough to incentivize you if it wasn't a big deal. So the headline was, first headline was only 50% made it to the 24 hours. The other 50% crawled back into the place where they'd taken all their gadgets and said, give me my gadgets back. This is the debriefing notes from the people who did make it. Okay, and they're describing what it felt like to be bereft of their gadgets. And so this is quite extreme. This is an addiction language, but it's like somebody's lost their arm or possibly their partner's died. It's very extreme language. And again, this is just a reflection of what's happening to us as human beings, as a culture, and as individuals. There was actually a big thing I remember from the first presidency of Obama, where he kind of made a big thing about having downtime, unplugged time with his family. So it was a big thing in the Obama household. So I was quite interested by this 2013 picture from Obama's inauguration. And this wouldn't be, we recognise this, and obviously there's some humour in that comparison, but actually that's quite a surprising picture. Somebody sitting at their own inauguration on the phone, actually, and so is the whole of their family. And you think about that from sort of 10 years back, actually this would always be regarded as being socially inappropriate and rude, but clearly not now. So our culture has changed in respect of what's sensible and allowable to do in terms of how we're interacting with our personal technology. Okay, so that's kind of contextual stuff. And what does this mean in terms of the privacy context? So I'm going to talk about 3 particular areas where I think AI has a pro-privacy possibility of increasing orders of difficulty and requiring increasing amounts of investment and political will. Okay, so the very simple one, which is stuff that we're doing at Manchester right now. We've had a bit of a breakthrough in the last few weeks on this. I could say that was my excuse for not having my slides ready, but the slides in here are actually not that new. So synthetic data. So one way you can think about sorting out confidentiality issues is to use synthetic data rather than real data. Now, synthetic data has a problem. It's not very acceptable for users. There's always issues about, how can I rely on this? Okay, so that's the essential problem. So what is it? What's synthetic data? So there are. All right, okay. So you start with some of your original data. This is your raw data over here. You can't share that or disseminate it because of disclosure control reasons. So you apply some disclosure control to it, and that leaves you some disclosure control data. Now, what you're doing effectively, and this was our key insight, is essentially you're moving through a space of possible data sets that could have been generated from the metadata. Okay, so there's this enormous space of possible data sets. And I've kind of put this down now to a single dimension, effectively. With synthetic data, what you do instead, traditionally, is you produce a model of the original data, and you use that model to produce the synthetic data. Now, the critical point here is your synthetic data is only going to be as good as your model. Okay, so that's sort of traditional approach. So our insight was, well, actually, what we're doing is moving around in a space here. We're in a space of data. So we can turn this into an AI problem, which is find me a data set which has the properties that I want. Let's not try and think about what the original data looks like at all. Let's just say, here's the space of possible data sets. Which one are we going to have? This is effectively what you're doing with these manipulations. Okay, you're moving through this space, only it's implicit, it's not explicit. So we're turning that into an explicit process. And the genetic algorithms are perfect for this. I'm just going to move on past this slide. Because essentially they are about navigating spaces. There are search mechanisms, and there are search mechanisms where you're trying to optimize a set of objectives. So we can give our data sets to our GA algorithm, and we say, find me a synthetic version of this which has these properties. Now, the properties can be whatever you want. So in our case, we say, well, we want this disclosure risk to be below a certain level, but we want all of these utility properties in there. We want all of these things that the users want to be in there as well. And we can define those, and you can give them as many objectives as you want. And basically what we're finding is it works. It does the job. So it works through the space until it finds something that has the desired properties. Now, this is a breakthrough in terms of SDC, because SDC has traditionally struggled with this issue of, well, we're going to do this disclosure control. Now we've got to somehow measure the utility downstream. We don't quite know what the effect is. And what we've done here is bring all that into one single framework. Because we're using this AI method, machine learning method, more specifically of genetic algorithms, to search that space, we can now optimize across both of the things that we're wanting to do, protect confidentiality and also produce data that's useful for analysts. Okay. So this is a second method. automated data environment analysis. This is kind of turning the problem of all these people having data round on its head. So data environment analysis, this is an invention again from Manchester. It was 2010. We published as academic papers. It came out of work from the 2011 census, where we ran a service for ONS called the Data Environment Analysis Service, which was essentially looking at what information is out there which could compromise ONS data releases. It was a very manual process, involves searching through data collection instruments, building metadata and so forth. Very difficult to do at scale. You need an army of people. Perhaps the Chinese government might be able to do this, but probably nobody else. One of the things, other aspects of this in general, is that SDC as a process tends to focus very much on the data set in question. So stare very hard at the data set. I parody, obviously, with my statistical tools and try and make it work. And actually, the context is really important when you're thinking about risk. Risk to confidentiality and possibly downstream to privacy. So it's what determines risk is the relationship between the data and its context, which is we call the data environment. So this is an automated system designed, this doesn't exist at all. This is a design for an automated system where we would make our assessment about risk. Now there's a little thing down in the corner here which will lead me on to the thing I'm going to talk about next, which is my data over here. But thinking about it from a NSI or some other data holder's perspective, they have a database, they want to make a release of some data, either into the public domain or possibly under some licensing arrangement or perhaps share it or whatever. And they want to know, is that risky to do? Am I going to compromise confidentiality assurances if I do that? It's a fundamental question they have to deal with. Okay, so the point of this system is that we're constantly, in real time, monitoring what data other people are collecting. So we have web crawlers here, which are doing that web crawly thing, where they're crawling around on the internet, checking out what's going on, gathering information, but they're gathering information on organizations who are collecting data. And one of the things they might do is look at collection instruments, but they might also look at secondary information about that. So building up a picture of what information is being picked up about what people, types of people, different levels again, in terms of thinking about the data structure. They're building an ontology of that. This is our data monitoring system. That feeds into a system which maps that ontology against this database which the statistical agency wants to release. We then use our synthesizer over here to produce a synthetic version of what that looks like. And then we use that, the relationship between this synthetic version and this database over here, to assess risk. So that's essentially an architecture for a potential system. Most of the stuff in here is kind of existing technology. So we would be essentially building on existing systems and making it work at scale in real time. So there's a big software engineering problem here, but there's quite a bit of research to do on how all those elements fit together. Now the thing you notice down in the corner here is this, my data. So because I'm also making decisions about who I want to share data with. Now the potential here, apropos the thing I'm about to go into now to finish this off, is that individual people can start making these decisions using such a system. Is this safe for me to do? Is this safe for me to make that decision to share my data with this company? Okay, so we're coming around to the thing of just-in-time consent. So very quickly, so I know I'm probably out of time, this is a mechanism for producing that thing which is a kind of holy grail for researchers, which is just-in-time consent, consent when it's actually needed. Now, the assertion here is that, again, all of the bits and pieces of technology to deliver this are already existing, okay? And they'll come at the end to what's required to make this happen. So you get a request for personal data access use. The emphasis here is on access. The model here is that everybody has their own data about them. Nobody else has data about them. So the individuals have data in a personal data store, which is all the data ever about them. What they are consenting to is access to that data store for particular purposes. So you get a request in, the request has a particular, the requester type, credentials of the requester in terms of trust, and what data is being requested, the the time that the access is required for, and the purpose. Actually, all the things we have to put on grant applications and applications to access data. This request doesn't go to me, it goes to my personal privacy avatar, which is a digital representation of my privacy policy. So I have a policy about who I'm going to share data with freely, who I'm going to share data with under certain conditions, who I'm going to share only some data with. So you might have a list of organizations that you just don't, well, this is like on your email, you don't want to get any emails from this company, quite happy to share any of my data with this person or this organization. And then you might parameterize that. And this is another little twist. You might give your personal privacy avatar some negotiating freedom, okay, to act on your behalf. So the parameters are inputs. What's the request profile of the organization? What type are they? Are they a military organization? Are they your bank? Are they the police force? Whoever. What's the purpose of the use? What's the data that's specifically been requested? What's the trust credentials of that organization, and so forth? And your outputs might be, I'll give them this, but I won't give them that. So I'll give them my demographic data, but I won't give them my health data, for example. You might also employ some personal disclosure control. There's a lot of work going on in SDCMO about individual level anonymization that's controlled by the data subject. So that's a very live research area. So you might have that built into your privacy avatar. So it might well be that your policy isn't relevant to a particular request, and at that point, the person might need to get involved and respond to the request directly. So privacy avatar sends a message, 2 minutes, yep, I'm nearly there. Okay, so one of the things about this is joining all this interesting stuff up. So we've mentioned the possibility of thinking about using this infrastructure for a risk assessment at an individual level. And if we have AI systems which enable that, then those sorts of processes are automatable to some degree and therefore could be used by a wide range of people with a certain level of education. This is the point I'll come to at the moment. So what is needed to deliver certainly the last of these, but all of them to some extent or another? We need research and development. The research is relatively modest. This isn't a £1 billion research program. The technology part of the research is really about integrating systems rather than the individual elements. There's quite a bit of software engineering required. That's the D part of that equation. Some infrastructure build. Okay, so we need the infrastructure to support this. Where are the personal data stores going to be, for example? Legal and regulatory change. There's a significant legal and regulatory change required because we're essentially handing responsibility for individual level data over to the individuals who the data is about. That implies responsibility in a legal sense as well. So there might be new requirements on individuals, and this relates to this point here. And I think these are the most important things. Okay? Education, because, well, okay, in order to be a functioning citizen in a digital economy, you're now going to have to be educated in how to do that, because it isn't just a kind of step through and using the latest app. This is something very different. And then political will. Okay, so if our political masters decide that they wanted to do this, then undoubtedly it would be possible. Okay, thank you.